Before anyone could react, a loud voice called from behind the officer. "What is going on here?" It was a commanding voice, sharp and filled with authority. Naomi turned toward the sound, her eyes widening in recognition. Standing in the doorway of the nearby cafe was none other than Mayor Linda Graham, a powerful ally of Naomi's in both business and social circles. The mayor had been watching the whole exchange from inside, her presence unnoticed until now. McCall froze, his gaze darting from Marcus to the mayor. The entire street seemed to hold its breath as Linda walked forward, her steps deliberate and firm. She wasn't just a politician, she was a woman who had faced her own battles with the system. She understood the stakes, perhaps better than anyone else. The mayor's voice cut through the silence again, this time directed at McCall. "What is going on here, officer? Explain yourself." The officer, now visibly shaken, stammered. She was obstructing my investigation. She didn't comply with my orders." His words were weak, his voice faltering under the weight of the mayor's presence. Naomi, standing tall now, looked at the officer with a calm fury in her eyes. "I didn't obstruct anything. I asked why I was being detained, and for that, you assaulted me." Her voice was steady but firm, and for a moment, McCall seemed to shrink under her gaze. Mayor Graham stepped forward, her face hardening. "This isn't the first time we've heard about you, Officer McCall. And let me make one thing clear. This will not be swept under the rug. You will be held accountable for your actions." The crowd behind them erupted in murmurs of agreement. Naomi had made it clear that this wasn't just about one incident, it was about everything. The racism, the abuse of power, the system that allowed people like McCall to act with impunity. And with the mayor now involved, it was no longer just a personal issue, it was a public one. A battle for justice had begun, and the stakes had never been higher. In the days that followed, the incident spread across news outlets, social media, and into the hearts of people across the country. Protests erupted in support of Naomi, calling for systemic change in law enforcement and a greater push for accountability. Naomi's story became a symbol, not just for Black women or billionaires, but for anyone who had ever been marginalized, dismissed, or overlooked. Her resilience in the face of adversity became a beacon of hope for those who believed in justice, no matter the cost. But it wasn't just Naomi's victory that made headlines, it was the ripple effect that followed. Officer McCall was placed on administrative leave while an investigation was launched, and soon after, the department was forced to take a closer look at its internal policies. The pressure on the system had reached a breaking point, and things were starting to shift. In the end, Naomi didn't just recover from the incident, she thrived. She used the platform her story had created to further her advocacy for social change, pushing for reforms in law enforcement, greater support for women of color in leadership positions, and increased attention to the toxic dynamics that existed within powerful institutions. She turned a moment of pain into an opportunity to create real, lasting change. As for McCall, the officer was ultimately fired, but that wasn't the end of the story. His dismissal sent a message that said the old ways of doing things weren't going to be tolerated anymore. The system was broken, but the fight for justice was far from over. Naomi's victory was just one step on a long road, one that she would continue to walk, no matter what. And as the dust settled and life began to return to normal, Naomi stood at the forefront of something much bigger than herself. She had become the face of a movement, and her story, her struggle, would resonate with people for years to come. Her message was simple: don't let anyone define your worth. Don't let anyone break you. And most of all, never stop fighting for what's right. In that moment, as she looked around at the world she had helped shift, Naomi knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning. As the courtroom emptied, the heavy silence still lingered in the air, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the fallout. Officer Thomas remained standing at the defendant's table, his hands gripping the edge, his knuckles white. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. How could he, a respected officer of the law, be humiliated like this? He had seen it all: criminals, defiant suspects, even fellow officers who had challenged his authority. But this was different. This was a Black woman, a judge, who had made him feel small. Made him feel like the very rules he enforced didn't apply to him anymore. The courtroom had witnessed the shift in the power dynamic. Judge Thompson had owned that room from the moment she walked in. It wasn't just about the case, it was about the broader struggle of respect, of authority, of racial and gender dynamics that had long been at play in a system that had been built on imbalances. But while the courtroom may have been left with a sense of justice served, Officer Thomas was far from ready to accept it. He had spent years climbing the ranks, cultivating a reputation that others respected, and yet, here he was brought down by a woman he thought he could dismiss. The anger simmering inside him was palpable. But so was the confusion. He had been prepared for a stern sentence, but this was something else. Back in her chambers, Judge Thompson sat at her desk, her fingers lightly tapping against the wood. She had seen it all before. Officers like Thomas were not new to her. She had encountered individuals who believed they were untouchable, who carried their arrogance like a shield. But she had also learned early on that the law wasn't about who you were or what you had. It was about what you did. And Officer Thomas had done more than just cross a line. He had stepped into a territory she wouldn't tolerate. Not in her courtroom, not under her watch. But as the anger started to fade, replaced by the familiar weight of responsibility, Judge Thompson couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought her here. She had earned her place on the bench the hard way, facing prejudice, doubt, and obstacles that many would have crumbled under. Every step, every promotion, had been a fight, not just for her career, but for her identity. She had learned to navigate a world that tried to tell her she didn't belong, that her presence was a mistake. But here she was, the one holding the power, the one who could deliver the verdict that would make a difference. This case wasn't just another judgment. It was a moment in time, a flashpoint in a long, ongoing battle for equity. As she reviewed the case details once more, her mind couldn't help but replay the moments in court when Officer Thomas had disregarded her authority, when he had dismissed her decisions with the kind of smug superiority that many had seen from him before. But now, in the silence of her office, it was clear to her. This wasn't just about one officer. This was about the larger system that had allowed such behavior to go unchecked for so long. It was about every time an officer thought his badge could shield him from accountability. Every time someone in power thought they could walk over others without consequence. But while Judge Thompson's resolve only grew stronger, the world outside her courtroom was beginning to take notice. Word of the case had spread like wildfire, sparking conversations across the city, and even beyond. People had seen the interaction, had heard the tension in the courtroom, and now everyone was waiting to see how this would play out. Would Officer Thomas retaliate? Would his department back him up, as they often did with officers who faced public scrutiny? Would this be a moment of reckoning, or would it simply fade into the background of another forgotten injustice? The phone rang in Judge Thompson's office, pulling her from her thoughts. It was the district attorney, someone she had worked with on numerous cases. She picked up the receiver, her voice calm but firm. Judge Thompson, I know you're in the middle of something, but we need to talk about Officer Thomas. His lawyer is already gearing up for an appeal. They're trying to discredit you, trying to say you were biased. They're even threatening to leak information about your past. Things that could turn this whole case upside down. Judge Thompson's grip on the phone tightened, but she didn't flinch. She had faced these threats before. The system would always try to protect its own, but she knew the truth. Let them try, she said, her voice steady. I didn't get here by backing down, and I'm not about to start now. But even as she spoke, she knew the stakes were higher than just her career. This case had taken on a life of its own, and she could feel the tension building. The more people talked, the more divided the city seemed to become. Some saw her as a hero, a woman standing up for what was right, a beacon of justice. Others saw her as a threat, an obstacle to be torn down. And Officer Thomas? His reputation, his career, everything was now on the line. He wasn't just fighting for his job. He was fighting for the respect he believed he deserved. As the days passed, the tension only grew. Protests began to form outside the courthouse, with people voicing their support for both sides. On one side, there were those rallying behind Judge Thompson, calling for justice, demanding accountability for those in power. On the other, there were people who felt the system was failing the very officers who protected their communities, who were being unfairly targeted and vilified. The pressure was mounting, and as the courtroom doors prepared to open again, everyone knew that the next chapter would be one they would never forget. Would Officer Thomas finally face the consequences of his actions? Would Judge Thompson's strength hold up under the pressure? And most importantly, how far would they both be willing to go to uphold their sense of justice? As the date of the final hearing approached, the entire city seemed to be holding its breath. The stakes were higher than ever, and the climax of this explosive confrontation was just around the corner. Would justice be served, or would the story take a turn no one saw coming? The day of the final hearing arrived, and with it came a storm of emotions. The streets outside the courthouse were filled with protesters, both for and against Judge Thompson, each side claiming their version of justice. The media was there in full force, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions, eager to capture the next big headline. The air was thick with anticipation, and inside the courtroom, the tension was almost unbearable. It felt like the whole world was watching, waiting to see how this would unfold. Officer Thomas arrived, flanked by his lawyer, his face a mask of defiance. He had spent the last few days digging in his heels, convinced that he could outlast the pressure. His department had backed him, and he had a team of powerful figures on his side. But there was something different about today. The air was charged with the weight of the moment, and for the first time, Officer Thomas felt a flicker of doubt. Judge Thompson walked into the courtroom with a quiet, commanding presence. The room fell silent as she took her seat on the bench. Her eyes scanned the room, meeting the gaze of Officer Thomas, and for a split second, there was a moment of recognition. Both of them knew that this was it. The final chapter. There would be no more stalling, no more games. The law would have its say, and no amount of influence could change that. The judge addressed the room, her voice steady but filled with authority. "Today, we are not just discussing the actions of one man," she said, looking at Officer Thomas, her gaze unwavering. "We are here to examine the very principles that should guide this courtroom, and the conduct of those who swear to uphold the law." Officer Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had seen her take on the toughest cases, but today felt different. It wasn't just the weight of the charges against him. It was the sense that Judge Thompson was doing something bigger, something that went beyond the legalities of the case. The proceedings began, and both sides presented their arguments. The defense tried to paint Officer Thomas as a hero, someone who had been wrongly targeted by a biased system. They referenced his years of service, his bravery in the field, and the numerous accolades he had received. But Judge Thompson, with her calm and measured tone, didn't let it sway her. She had seen through these tactics before. She had heard these arguments countless times, used by others to avoid facing the consequences of their actions. And today, she would not be swayed. As the defense wrapped up, Judge Thompson called for a brief recess. The room buzzed with hushed conversations, but the judge remained silent, her thoughts a whirlwind of considerations. She had made up her mind, but the stakes were high. This case had become symbolic, not just for Officer Thomas, but for everyone who had been wronged by those who believed they were untouchable. She wasn't just rendering a verdict today, she was making a statement about accountability, a statement about what happens when power is abused and when justice is served. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt heavier, more electric, as if something monumental was about to unfold. Judge Thompson stood, her voice calm but firm as she delivered her verdict. "Officer Thomas," she began, her eyes never leaving his, "your actions in this case have not only violated the law, but have shown a complete disregard for the integrity of the justice system. You have used your badge as a shield to avoid responsibility, and today, you will face the consequences." There was a collective gasp in the room. Even though everyone had been expecting it, hearing those words aloud felt like a punch to the gut. Officer Thomas's face turned pale as the weight of the judge's words sank in. He had expected to walk away, to continue his life as if nothing had happened. But in that moment, he knew it was over. The judge had made her decision, and no amount of influence could undo it. Judge Thompson continued, "You are hereby stripped of your position as a police officer, and all charges related to this case are upheld. This court will recommend further investigation into your conduct during your time as an officer." Officer Thomas didn't speak, didn't move, his eyes locked on the judge as if trying to will himself out of this reality. The room was silent, the gravity of her decision settling in. He had lost everything, the respect, the power, the protection. In a moment, it had all been taken away. As the gavel fell, signaling the end of the hearing, Judge Thompson sat back in her chair, the weight of her decision lifting slightly. She had done what was right. It hadn't been easy, but it was necessary. And while the victory felt sweet, she knew this was just one small step in a much larger fight for justice. A fight that didn't end with one officer, one case, or even one courtroom. It was ongoing, and every victory mattered. As the courtroom slowly emptied, there was a palpable sense of relief. People who had supported Judge Thompson cheered quietly outside the courthouse, while those who had opposed her remained in stunned silence. The verdict had been delivered, but the aftermath was just beginning. For Judge Thompson, this was just another chapter in a long journey. But for Officer Thomas, this was the end of his story in the force. The system had worked in a way that many had feared it wouldn't, and the repercussions of this case would echo for years to come. As the camera zoomed out, capturing the faces of the people who had been affected by this case, the message was clear. In a world where power and privilege often shielded those who should be held accountable, there were still moments when justice would rise above. And sometimes, those moments were enough to change the course of history. Story of the arrogant officer and the determined judge had come to a close, but the conversation was far from over. It had sparked a dialogue about accountability, respect, and the importance of holding those in power to the same standards as everyone else. And that, in itself, was the true victory. As the final credits rolled, the reflection was unavoidable. This wasn't just a story about a man and a woman in a courtroom. It was a story about justice, and how it can make the seemingly impossible possible.